So probably about, oh gosh, it was 8 years ago now, 8 or 9 years ago. I had become officially a Massachusetts resident. And so for those of you, when you change your residency, you know to do all of kind of like the important things, right? Change my driver's license, I got new insurance, all of that fun stuff. What you don't think about changing is your estate planning documents. And most people definitely don't think about changing them at, the age of 22. But I was lucky that my mom had a friend who is an attorney in Massachusetts who was actually teaching the elder law class at law school at Suffolk. And so I offered to do the signing appointment kind of for her class so her class could see what a, traditional signing appointment would look like. And, well, what it reminded me of is that most people don't think about estate planning documents as something that they have to do or they have to change when they change residencies. Most laws are federal, but there are state specific things that everybody has to kind of pay attention to. I remember for me, and I know we've talked about powers of attorneys on here, but the interesting thing when I moved from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts is that in Massachusetts, I couldn't have an and or an or. You had to like list people individually. So in Pennsylvania, I could say like I wanted both my parents to make the decisions. And in Mass, I actually had to rank them. But, I was thinking about that and thinking about our listeners and, Nan, and we were so fortunate that you were able to do her estate planning documents. And that made so many things easier kind of as we moved through. And so, I really think it's important to take some time today to talk about wills and trusts. The decision makers are so important. And we did an episode on powers of attorneys. And if you haven't listened, we really encourage you to go listen to that. But there's a whole other facet of planning that I think is really important to talk to people about. So I want to welcome everybody. This is the Hey Woman podcast. So my name is Cortney, and I'm here with my mom, Julie, who has been a practicing attorney for about 20 years. And
A little more than that,
a little
but I
more.
appreciate that.
Yeah, we don't have to get into that with the
Mhm.
listeners. And so, this is real conversations about caregiving, love, and legacy. And sometimes we tackle the emotional parts of that journey. But today, I think it's important to talk about something a little bit more technical because when there's so many things going on, planning early can really save you. And we were really able to move through Nan's estate relatively simply because she had the appropriate plan in place.
Well, I think, Court, before we jump into that, I think you missed two important points. First, love to give a shout out to Supernaut and Vineski, which is the law firm in Massachusetts that you use. Fantastic law firm.
Yes.
Second of all, I think it's important to everybody to understand that it wasn't your first time doing your estate planning,
Was
that
not.
it was your 18th birthday present. And, I don't know, it doesn't seem like you were excited about that for your 18th birthday.
It's not what every kid wants, for their 18th birthday to sit down at the dinner table and decide who's gonna pull the plug,
Yeah.
if so needed to be done. But I think, we joke about it, and for us, it wasn't a hard conversation to have, because 'cause we've had them at the dinner
Hmm.
table for years, and so, I knew who I wanted it to be. And, we talk about those decision makers all the time, but, there's the big question of, what happens to my stuff?
Yeah. And I put to point that out because I think it's important for everybody to understand that estate planning documents, and again, we're going to focus on wills and trusts today, but estate planning documents are for everybody. Once a child turns 18, parents no longer have the ability to make their decisions. And that's important. Your child goes off to college, and they end up in the hospital, and you actually, because of HIPAA, may not be able to get access to information. And that's a federal law. So estate planning is important for everybody. Of course, in Nan's situation, she very much did her estate planning. Sometimes she didn't use me as the attorney; she used somebody else at my office, and that's okay because it's hard to talk to me about those things. But it's something she was very much willing to participate in. And what I was able to do for Nan and for our family is something I'd want for anybody, which was we were able to make it so that we didn't have to probate her estate, and I'll talk about what that means. Because we used a trust for some of her items. So, a will is really just a document that says, "Here's who gets what my stuff." But when you pass away, you have to put it through the probate court in every state. And it's gonna be different in different states. There's some states that it's very formalized, and there's some states that it's a little bit easier. But in no state is it not an extra step. And so, important to have a will to say who gets what stuff, but also important sometimes to not use a will to avoid that probate process. You can avoid that probate process by a trust, which I'll talk about a little bit, but it's not the only way. Beneficiary designation. So, something everybody can do, like if you're caregiving for somebody right now, or you're thinking about it for yourself, one of the best things you can do is take every part of all of your assets and write them down. Because honestly, identifying what people have is actually hard sometimes.
No, it is. Sometimes just like that's the hardest part. I think even today, because they're all apps on our phone. And so not only writing down the asset, which we would recommend like the asset, its current value, what date you got that value, and what financial institution, any account numbers, also the username and password
Yes.
is kind of like, we've moved on from the old school. We would recommend, putting it in a fireproof safe. People don't have fireproof safes anymore,
Mhm.
or because they don't have the physical documents, it's all electronic. But if you can't get in there to access the information or even know what the accounts are worth, I think sometimes people are maybe surprised by the accumulation of things, especially if you have like retirement accounts and you've changed jobs a couple of times. Like they may just be sitting there and, kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the first step is really identifying those assets, wherever they are, electronic, digital, and I think it's even more important because things could be forgotten. So, Nan was really good at that. She
Mhm.
had not anything digital.
No.
She had little file folders and everything was organized, and she had kept up with who were the beneficiaries. Are they who she wanted to be the beneficiaries of certain things like life insurance, her IRA, those types of things. No, some of those things she had depleted. She had spent it on her care, but she made good decisions about like what she used to pay for care and those types of things. So identifying it sounds like not a big deal, but it is a huge step. As Courtney said, like writing it all down. Sometimes when people pass away, we're actually looking at old income tax returns to try to find maybe something that they got interest income from, just to identify what those are. And then we want to think about from the perspective of how should that pass. And again, if the last will and testament is kind of like a default document. So if nothing else controls it, the will is going to control it. So a lot of times people have like a bank account that's just in their name, or they have a car that's just in their name, and that's definitely going to go through that. But any account. Other types of accounts, annuities, life insurance, brokerage accounts, often you can put a named beneficiary on them. That's an important thing to do, although it may not be enough because there could be taxes. And the question is if somebody gets that account, who pays the taxes? There's going to be state by state differences. But because of that, and because people often want to give money or things to their children in a certain way, we often use a trust. And a trust is really just a written set of instructions.
And I think, I want to urge the listeners to really think about TV, reality TV, any, scripted shows. They've done kind of trust funds a little dirty, for lack of a better term. You know what I mean? Like people think like, oh, I don't have enough money for a trust fund, or,
Mhm.
a trust fund is for very wealthy people. It's for celebrities. And that's not true at all. Trusts do all kinds of things for all kinds of purposes. There could be a pet trust if you have a pet and you want to leave,
Certainly, Minnie deserves a pet
she
trust.
does, and if Fun Uncle DJ has to take control of Minnie, if something were to happen to me, it would be important for me that he has the money to do for the dog what I would do.
Well, yeah, she has a quality of life.
That she has to sustain, right? I
Yeah,
mean, and
standard
there
of
should be
living.
money for that, for the Easter baskets and the daycares and all of and
Mhm.
her insurance, right?
Mhm.
So, I think it's important for people to continue to listen, because trusts are not just for the ultra wealthy. They're not just for celebrities. They're for everybody who has something and they want to make sure it goes to the right people. I think, so often people have worked so hard throughout their life, and I think this was something that was nice for Nan. It was always she was always clear about what she had and where she wanted it to go. And, I, as the grandchild who was, she always wanted things to go to the grandchildren. I think Nan made good decisions.
You yeah, it wasn't the kids, it was the
Yeah.
grandchildren, yeah, but, honestly, in my practice court, I see that often. I see people who come in and who, at one point in time, everything goes to their kids, and then they come back in and they decide that they really do like those grandchildren better. So it's Nan's not all that unusual.
Right.
Really has nothing to do with your Uncle Buddy and I.
No, no,
It
no,
was
it's just, it's a theme that we're seeing that she participated in.
Yeah, but I think for a trust, I think you're so right. It's not like an amount of money. It's really whether or not you have a goal
Mhm.
that that trust thing can accomplish. So, like for instance, people who have children who have special needs, some sort of like a disability, often we will use a special needs trust. And the purpose of that, or the goal in that, is to be able to protect assets that can go to those children who have a disability, who could be adults, adult dependent. Um, and not lose whatever benefits they have. So if they're on SSI or medical assistance. And those types of trusts, the government very much understands that the assistance that's given through like medical assistance, SNAP, SSI really isn't enough. And so a supplemental needs trust or a special needs trust, they often are used interchangeably, is really to supplement what they already have to sort of add extra to it. Now there's rules about it, but that just gives a good example of if I have a child who has a special needs, that's the goal. The goal is that I'm trying to protect that child. How that plays out can depend on the diagnosis that we're working with. Does the child have autism, Down syndrome? What is it, and what does the care look like in the coming years, especially if the mom and dad who provide maybe residential support, maybe help filling out forms, what happens when they're not there. Other types of trusts do other things. Like, for instance, we have revocable living trusts that are really designed to avoid probate. Sometimes we have some high end tax planning that they do. But my clients, often one of the things that they're really concerned about is, they often really like their own children, but their in-laws they're concerned about. And that's a valid concern because, the divorce rate is so high. So if I pass away and I give my money to my kids, do I want that to go to my in-laws, daughter-in-laws, son-in-laws, those types of things, or should it pass down, through the generations? And so often we'll use a trust where we're able to give an inheritance to a child who can access it, use it, but it could be sheltered from their divorce in the coming years. And that's often something that people think about. And again, just statistically, not talking about good and bad people, but just statistically, if somebody has three children, at least one of their children is probably going to get divorced. And so we want to think about how does that play out? And it's not my job as an attorney to tell people how to feel about it. It's my job as an attorney to say, here's a tool that can be used to accomplish that goal.
I think that's really important to talk about, and I think sometimes I think that's why people tend to give money to the grandchildren instead of the kids, because you don't know what's gonna happen,
Mhm.
and it's not that that means that you don't like your son-in-law or your daughter-in-law or that your children didn't pick the right spouse. What it means is that you don't know what people are gonna be like 30 years from now, and so but you always are steadfast in your goal, and so that's what a trust can give you is that no matter what happens in the world, what happens to your kids, your grandchildren, the goal that you set aside, the trust is the tool to kind of make that happen. And I think that's really important for people to understand is that we're not here to judge people or families or decisions, but we're here to let you know that if you have a specific goal, I think one and maybe something you're going to talk about next is yeah, I hear a lot that the goal of people is education.
Mhm.
And I think education is so important important, and I know that was always important to Nan, it was always important to you, but setting up, a trust or something like that so that your grandchildren have access to education and you can take away maybe some of the burden of student loans or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly see a lot of that. We see people who do 529 plans, which have a tax advantage. You then can put those 529 plans in a trust and think about the trust as the set of instructions. Like, what happens if the child doesn't go to school? Can they use the money for other things? How much money is available? Are there any types of institutions that you favor or not favor? Does it have to be a traditional 4-year college, or could it be a trade or technical school? And again, my job is not to say what that should be. It's up to the person whose money it is to determine that they feel comfortable and that's what they would want. And it's really important because as people age, sometimes they help like their oldest grandchild with education. They go to school, but this would be an ability to say, well, even if we pass away, we want to continue to do that to the other grandchildren as they go forward to be fair, so that everybody has the same access or the same information. So I think that's, that is another goal. I also think, there's a huge wave now of caregiver trusts, which is
Mhm.
something that we do in our office. And there's attorneys around the nation who are talking about, as you're planning, how are we going to pay for your care? And what type of care do you want? Do you want in home care? Do you want facility care? It's really interesting with that. What we see is, most people want to stay with their spouse. So when they do the caregiver trust, they're setting aside an amount of money that's designed to pay for care. And they often want to move with their spouse. And the reason that sticks with me is that often when people get older and they're not able to make their own decisions, nobody, the system, their children really honors the fact that those spouses would want to stay together, even if they're at different levels of care. And so I find that work really, really interesting. And when I think about Nana, one of the things that I think my job did for me that was helpful was that I was able to have discussions with her about what her care was, and what she wanted to be. And I was in a situation where I could help supplement that. But, just understanding that, yeah, we do want to use money to stay home and maybe pay a child to be a caregiver, and that's okay. So those types of trusts are not so much when somebody dies, but even during life. How do we want to see this play out? And I think that's important. We'll see a lot more of that. We see well-being trust, which we've talked about before, but just the idea that that trust is honoring something that's important to that person. I think that's really important for people to be thinking about.
And I think, for everybody listening, what we're, kind of boiling down what we're suggesting is one, researching different things that are out there and available and understanding, what the probate process might look like in your state is really important. And therefore, like, it's really important to contact an attorney to have these conversations, a state specific attorney. And I think, what that does too is these can be really weird conversations and awkward conversations to have if you're not like kind of like in this space, Like you and I both work here, and even it was hard for you to have these conversations with Nan because she may not have said everything to you that she kind of needed to say.
Mhm.
And it's important that she is able to think this through. And that's what a third party can do. That's what a law firm can do for you is give you kind of an outlet to expand, to understand this is my specific assets. This is what I have. What's the best plan for me if these are my goals? And they can tell you what your goals could be, what are the options? But it's really important to kind of open up that conversation earlier. I've never seen a client come in and be like, gosh, like we started our planning too
Yeah.
early.
No.
Because sometimes the earlier you are, the more options you have. If you're in a crisis and you're standing at the hospital at 4 o'clock on a Friday and you have nothing, your
Mhm.
options are really limited. I think even like what you said about college kids having powers of attorney, it's really important because if your 18-year-old child is in the hospital, you want the information, and it's not the doctor's fault that he can't give it to you. It's incredibly frustrating, and I think that's a totally valid emotion, but we also have to respect that the doctor took an oath and HIPAA's there for a reason.
Mhm.
And it does what it's supposed to do, which is control the access of information to people that they want. And so with all of this, like I just think it's important too, because there can be some cultures and some customs that play into this. It's interesting when we were talking, I was thinking about the trip that we took to Colombia
Mhm.
and how their system is so different. And it really is set up for if a spouse passes away, that the assets go to the kids.
Right.
So in the US, there's, a little bit more of an underlying assumption that if one spouse passes away, they want the assets to go to the other spouse. But in Colombia, it very much like the assets go to the children if it goes through probate. And
Except for the state of Louisiana.
that's true. Louis
Mhm.
and so some of those are like old French laws, kind of
Mhm.
depending on where you're at.
But very much, in Europe, many of those countries also, come from that kind of paradigm or framework that we learned about in Colombia.
Right. And so if that's important to you, it's not just because the government system here is set up different, doesn't mean you couldn't use a trust with those sets of instructions to accomplish your goal.
Yeah, I think it's so important when we think about these types of trust. Another goal I want to talk about, I think we would be remiss is, this isn't when somebody dies, but even during life, is trusts that are designed to protect against something. So at our office, we call them protector trusts. But in other states or other offices, they could be called income only trusts. The idea of it is I would put an asset in there and to be able to protect it so that I could access benefits. And just so everybody knows that that could be like nursing home benefits. And that's really important to protect a spouse or protect a family business. There are look back periods with that so that we need to do that at a certain amount of time, typically 5 years prior to somebody needing care. And so, again, another use of a trust. And it really doesn't matter how much people have. Sometimes they have a family farm that is they want to pass down over their generations or a business. And so it would be really important to have some protection if mom or dad gets sick, and particularly to make sure that the spouse, the healthier spouse, isn't left financially compromised. And so, again, and just another use of a trust. That's why I think. Again, in Nan's situation, I think the thing that we were able to do is to use trust to meet her goals, and then it made it easier when she passed away because we didn't have to deal with all this other stuff. We didn't
Right.
have to probate. We didn't have to do anything with her will. Now, she still had a trust, and that still has to be administered in our state. And in our state, there is inheritance tax that has to be dealt with, but it's not. We do not have to deal with it in the same way that we would, a will. And so I think sometimes we think about meeting people's goals, but also I think a lot of times when clients in my office, one of their goals when they come to me is to make things that they're organized and simplified for their loved ones so that they don't have to do extra work. And I think that's so important too.
I think we hear that a lot from caregivers too. If they took care of their parents and their parents weren't organized, it's really important for them to, kind of get their information organized so their kids don't go through what they go through.
Mhm.
And it's something too, like if you're caring for a parent, there's nothing that's saying that you can't do your planning at the same time.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the nice things that like lots of firms will do like Zoom meetings too. If, taking your loved one to a law firm is more complicated. You can a lot of the elder law firms, the ones that we kind of recommend or deal with, they're very flexible in their processes to allow for any mobility or any different things. They'll do some of them if your loved ones are in facility, some of them will do travel signings, so actually bring the documents right into the facility. Because the chances are they have more than one client in the
Mhm.
facility. And so they're able to kind of stop by and see other clients. There may be an additional fee for that, there may not be, but it's nice to have the options kind of all out there. The other thing, I think that's really important that people should think about is there's always a trustee of the trust.
Oh, true. Yeah, good point. Good point. I should bring that up as the attorney, right? Who's the decision maker? Go ahead. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so, in Nan's situation, I actually am the trustee of the
Mhm.
trust. Um,
'Cause again, couldn't be me.
no,
Yeah.
could not be. The the attorney with lots of experience definitely didn't make sense. And with that, there's a little bit of power, right?
Yeah.
So there's some money in there, and there's, conversations being had about what to do with the money. And for
'Cause
me,
her choice was that the grandchildren didn't get it until they were, like, 29?
yes.
Yeah.
However, if I sign off on it, the rules of the kind of the
Mhm.
rules of the game, right? The rules of the trust is I can sign off on it and they can get the money earlier. And so, and she, just so everybody knows, she made the decision to make me the trustee and I was not 29 years old.
No, you were not, but you're
sh
the oldest grandchild.
Yep. And I think, I spent a lot of time with Nan, and I hope that, the reason that she picked me is, kind of the way that I'm approaching the decision making is if they come to me and they want money for something that Nan would deem important.
Yes.
That is what that is an area in which I would, kind of sign on that line and have the money be distributed early. So something like that could be, one of my cousins is getting married. And it would be important to my Nan if there was something that she wanted for her wedding, like her wedding dress. Now she was able to find a very, very nice vintage dress that actually wasn't that expensive. But if her dream dress had come from, anywhere, that money could have been used for that. I have another cousin who's maybe buying a house. And so, the down payment for that house would be something that Nan would deem very important. Wedding dress, house, they feel different, but those are things that would have been important to Nan.
Yeah, and there's no doubt about that, that there are things that she would have honored.
Yes. So, I think about like the way that she's made decisions in her life, and that's the way that I, try to make these decisions as I move forward. Education was really important to Nan. Making sure that we all have a safe place to go. A safe car could be something that's
Mhm.
important to Nan, but at the end of the day, it's a lot of responsibility. And so, they did choose me because I was the oldest, but that doesn't always make that person the best person. You want to think about who is going to honor your wishes and follow the rules of the game as best as they were laid out.
And I also think, a trustee is also somebody who needs to build bridges with people. And so, not have somebody who is going to alienate part of the family. And so I think you also have worked hard to develop relationships with all of the grandchildren, both your siblings and your cousins. And I think that you kind of go across the bounds with that. And I think that's important. You don't necessarily want to pick the person who's not going to be listening or not going to be open to suggestions. And so I think that trustee role is actually really important. Who that decision maker is has to know what your intent and your goals are. And again, in this situation, that's easy with Nana because she was very she very much honored education. We know that. There's just no doubt about that. Nobody could argue against that. So there's certain things that she just really did honor. But I think for many people, taking the time to write it down, and some of this would go into a trust document, but some of it also could be just a memorandum behind it, kind of what the intent was. And so, it used to be that attorneys didn't spend as much time trying to talk about these things. What is really the intent? We used to just use what we called the HEM standard, health, education, maintenance, and support. And that came out of the tax law. But again, there's like this growing force in the US that you just using a tax law standard isn't really the best. I'm not saying that we have to know about them and we have to deploy them so that we don't cause people extra taxes. But really the intent of any trust is, it's a written set of instructions. And so what are the instructions, and let's take time to develop them and make sure that it's helpful for families. And at one point in time, we talk about this as, saving time for whoever has to deal with a crisis or deal with somebody passing away, but also making it so that, there aren't fighting. The more that you can write down, the more that people know what you wanted, the better. I often think about early in my career, I was often court appointed to do work where people got into fights. And having done that work, what I would say to most people is that even though families were fighting, both sides really did think they were right. Like,
Mm.
they really did think that they were honoring the intent of their parent. And without something written down, something that we could look to as the courts or the attorneys involved that really definitively said, no, this is what they wanted, it was hard, because I don't think there was a good side or a bad side. I think that people heard what they heard and they internalized it in a certain way. And so that's why it's so important that these documents are clear. We talked a couple of times about the fact that there are attorneys out there that, do this. And we do have a site, planningandprotecting.com. And I urge people to look on there and find attorneys in their own area that are familiar with the concepts that we're talking about, and are able to deal with kind of how we approach this or how I approach this, which is a lot of hand holding and not just slapping a document at somebody, but really understanding what their goals are so that that written set of instructions, if it is a trust, really reflects what people want. And I think that that's important for people to understand. For many places, they'll offer some sort of very low cost or free initial consultation. Many places too today offer seminars or webinars. I encourage people to listen to a webinar or go to a seminar ahead of time. Get yourself a little educated so that you know what's important and have formulated kind of what your goals are. Because as the attorney, I can't draft the documents unless I know what your goals are. And sometimes people don't know, you don't have to know everything before you go to the law office, but having thought about it a little bit is helpful.
Right, because you can start the process, even if you're starting with powers of attorneys or,
Mhm.
lots of times an attorney can start a process and it gives you time to think about some other things. And so, no, I encourage people to do that. I also encourage you, if you're listening and you're an attorney and you go on the Planning and Protecting site and we don't have somebody from your state, to go ahead and reach out on the site.
Mhm.
There's all of our contact information. We would love to be able to offer attorneys in all 50 states, and we cover almost a little over half at this point in time. But we're always looking for attorneys from different states who kind of believe the same thing that we do. That this is more than just a document. This is somebody's life, and it's important. I also think, and we're not going to dive too much into this, but I think we'd be remiss to not say something that. Um, you also don't have to leave a huge inheritance for people.
Right. Right. I have lots of clients that don't. Yeah.
It really is okay to spend the money now.
Mhm.
And I think, you
Or
can,
donate to charity. I
yep.
also have lots of clients who do that. They have a certain amount that they want to go to their children, and then whatever is above that goes to charity. Absolutely. I think that is an important point.
And I think, especially, if you have a grandkid and they want to do a dance class or something, you could keep track of that to make sure that it's fair, but paying for it now so you can go to the dance recitals or pay for, it's funny. It's Little League time, and we both are from, Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is the home of the Little League World Series. But even Little League, like signing up for Little League can get expensive and buying the
Yes.
bats and the gloves and all of that stuff. And it's a fun to go watch the kids play baseball if that's what they want. But, if the parents aren't in a situation as the grandparents, maybe you step in and you offer to pay for some of this stuff. We're not talking about giving away thousands and thousands of dollars if that's not your situation.
Mhm.
But it's funny, $100 really could change somebody's day. week
Yeah.
or month. And so I think, don't be hesitant to, spend some of that money now. Some of that's working with a financial advisor or getting a plan with an attorney so you know how much money you can afford to spend kind of year over year to make sure there's enough money for care. But
And to use the money for care,
yes.
like, not to save it, but to use it for care. So, we talk a lot about care, and obviously part of this is caregiving for Nana, but I want to underscore, I think you have a important point that, you can spend it and spend it on your own care and good care.
Yeah. You owe nobody a large inheritance or a small inheritance
Mhm.
or any inheritance. Use the money to make your final chapter you want it to be. And maybe that's attending little league games for, a grandchild. Maybe it's getting good food delivery services because the food at the facility that you're at isn't what you want it to be, right? There's no wrong use of your money. It's yours and you've worked really hard for it. And so we just want people to know there are options. So planning is great if you want to spend it while you're alive. It's funny. Nan always said to do some giving while she's living.
Mhm.
And so, she used to take us shopping. And she took me shopping to buy me my first suit before, my first, real job. And that was important to her. And that was and we would say that that was a good use of her money because it made her happy and it's what she wanted to do with it. And so I think, it's just really sitting down and thinking about what your goals are and how do you get there. Money is a tool, trusts are tools, wills are tools. And so reach out to people that spend their lives kind of helping people, build their toolbox.
Yeah, and the most important thing is figure out what your goals are, and then hire a professional who understands the tools, like the wills, powers of attorneys, to determine, what's the best in your situation.
So, we want to thank everybody for listening in. Again, if you're interested in an attorney in your area, please go to the planningandprotecting.com site. There's lots of information. There are some free resources on there that will kind of dive into this a little bit deeper. All of our other episodes are on there. So, if you're just joining and you'd like to listen to more different episodes on different topics, please feel free. Also, follow along on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram at the Hey Woman Podcast. And we so appreciate you listening.
Thanks, everybody.